if I do choose to have children, what can I do to be the best parent that I possibly can be, in spite of not having had good parents myself? What can I do to reduce as much as possible the impact that the intergenerational trauma in my family will have on my child? Because when we ask the question that way, then we open up to the possibilities of, things that you can learn, books that you can read, podcasts that you can listen to, in order to give yourself a lot of skills to be able to be the best parent that you can be, even if you didn't necessarily have great parents yourself.
I'm Keltie McGuire, and you're listening to the Kids Are Childfree podcast. Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Kids Are Childfree podcast. Today's guest is someone that I found based on a bunch of the messages and requests that I've had from you over on Instagram. And I've had a number of you saying to me, I had a really difficult upbringing. I maybe faced abuse or trauma, some sort of neglect. Perhaps it was just a really difficult relationship that you had with your parents. And this is giving you additional pause as to whether or not you yourself want to have kids. And some of the questions I'm getting are like, how do I disentangle what happened to me versus my own desires about whether or not I want to have a child? You're wondering about whether you would be well equipped to parent based on the experiences that you've had. There are all sorts of feelings that are mixed up on this, and you are wanting to have some counsel from somebody who knows these topics intimately. And that is why I've invited on none other than Katherine Ripley, who is a licensed clinical social worker offering both individual therapy and group coaching programs. Katherine works with adult survivors of child abuse and childhood emotional neglect, and she uses primarily somatic methods to support people in processing their emotions through their bodies. I am so excited to have Katherine on the show today because she is just the perfect person to help address these questions that you're having about the past experiences that you faced in your childhood and how that relates to your Kids Are Child-Free decision. Hello, Katherine, and welcome to the podcast. I was telling Katherine just before we started recording that I have been searching for her. I have been looking for her for the last few months since we started the podcast. She didn't know it, but she's now been informed. And the reason why is because I've had so many people asking, like, we want to hear from someone who specializes in trauma. And me as a coach, I'm really interested in hearing about the somatic side of things, which you may or may not know what that entails, but you're going to find out very soon. So we've got lots of good stuff today. We're going to get right into it. And to open things up, I'd love to hear a little bit in your own words who you are and what we need to know about you, Katherine.
Yeah, for sure. So I am an LCSW, licensed clinical social worker. I am a somatic therapist and a coach. And basically what that means is that I support people in working through their bodies to access their core emotions, to process their traumas, and to cultivate more self-compassion and let go of negative beliefs about themselves.
Okay, you hit pretty much all the marks on things that I've been working through myself. Self-compassion, connecting with ourselves, our bodies. This is something I hear from a lot of people that they struggle with. And I work predominantly with women, and I have a few sort of philosophies about why this is difficult for us. And of course, trauma plays a role, but I've got a few other thoughts as well in terms of like why, especially as women, we find that tough to tap into. I'm throwing you a curveball because we didn't discuss this as an opening question, but what are your thoughts in terms of like why this is so difficult for so many of us to do?
Yeah. I think that one of the big factors here is the amount of anxiety that we have. A lot of people don't necessarily know this, but anxiety is actually a defense against emotion. And a lot of us walk around with just a lot of anxiety day in and day out pretty constantly. That sort of thinking about the future in an anticipatory and worrying way, that is actually a way of avoiding going into the vulnerable emotions at the core. the mind gets very occupied with trying to anticipate future scenarios or thinking about, well, if I do this or if I do that, what's going to happen or what's going to happen with this circumstance. And it's a way of actually bringing you further away from yourself. And it's understandable like that happens a lot, because anxiety is also a way of trying to have control over things that we really don't have control over. So definitely an understandable impulse. But when we're living in that anxiety so much of the time, it means that we don't really get to drop into our body, don't get to really get to know what the body is holding so much. And we miss a lot of those core emotions that we're carrying.
Wow. I have to say, I've worked with quite a few different therapists and coaches and practitioners over the better part of my life. I'd say my entire adult life. I've never heard anxiety framed quite that way before, especially this was what felt really, I guess, notable or profound to me is that it's a way of avoiding emotion. Is that how you put it? Did I get that right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And
Yep.
I think for most people, and I'm someone I have struggled with anxiety. I don't like to have that be my whole identity too much. It's something I talk about a little bit on the podcast, but I think people who are anxious, we feel that is the emotion, that the anxiety is the emotion itself. And yet I know for me where there is and where I can find peace is in being with and in like rather because there is more avoidance that wants to happen when we feel anxious. It's like we go further and further away, as you sort of indicated, rather than like being in and with it and looking at what's underneath of it. So thank you for that. Okay. Woo. All right. We're in for a good conversation. Okay. So as we always do on the podcast, I'm curious to hear from you in terms of this big decision that we addressed, the helping predominantly women, but all kinds of folks look at the question of, do I want to have kids? Do I want to stay child free? Where are you on that question or choice?
Yeah, I do want to have kids for sure. And I think that that's something that I've always wanted. Even like going through the process of dating, like that was a question that I would kind of ask people like pretty early on,
Yeah.
just to, like make sure that we were on the same page about that, because I always knew that it was something that I wanted for myself.
Yeah. Okay. I always love hearing this when people have this certainty, whether it's around the child-free choice or around, the motherhood question. I also have my past self has envy because I think, oh gosh, it would be so nice to just have this like inherent knowing that this is something that you want. I'm curious for you, like, what does that knowing and certainty feel like in your body? And sort of the second part of that, what particular aspects of parenthood feel exciting? Like when you say, this is something I always knew I wanted or that I would like to have, what particular aspects of it excite you?
Yeah. I think the answers to the two questions are actually kind of similar,
Okay.
because I think I would say that, when I contact how it feels in my body, it feels like an excitement about the future. It feels like a sort of positive, energizing feeling about when I get to that point in my life where I do feel ready to have kids. I look forward to that. It's like I feel called forward to it. And
Yeah.
in terms of what excites me about parenthood, I think that there is a lot of joy in getting to be around children because of the fact that they are so whimsical and they are so immersed in this world of play and joy, and being able to participate in that
Yeah.
with small humans is something that excites me. And also, being able to raise good humans, like to raise people who have good values and who are going to grow up to be kind and to want to contribute to the world in a positive way. That's something that I'm excited about.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to hear that you want to raise kids, those types of kids, because those are what our world needs. And I know, following your content on Instagram and learning a little bit about yourself, like you are someone who certainly does not have your eyes closed as to the ways of the world and a lot of the challenges that we find ourselves in, whether it's environmentally, politically. I'm curious, how do you contend with that? And like, do you or have you had anxiety around bringing a child into this world? Because I know this is something that gives a lot of people pause. Like, should I be having a child? What's this going to mean? I mean, we talk about anxiety, and I think that's a major anxiety provoking factor for a lot of people. So how do you grapple with that yourself?
Absolutely. That is definitely something that I have experienced. That worry of like, wow, like things seem pretty bleak sometimes. And, do I want to bring a child into these circumstances? I think it's important to keep in mind that when we are talking about, okay, like the state of the world and, like, do I want to bring kids into this? We have to be mindful of the amount of pessimism and hopelessness that can kind of invade that decision. Because while it is true that there is a lot of bad stuff that's happening right now, I always try to remind people that we have to be careful not to get sucked into hopelessness and despair. Because if we get sucked into those places, then we lose our power to be able to try to change things. And I want to look at the world from a place of, recognizing what is wrong currently, not sugarcoating it, but maintaining a sense of hope that I can contribute to and work with my community in pursuit of collective liberation, and that it is possible to exert some kind of change. And having kids can be a part of that. Like, not that I think that people should bring children into the world like solely for the purpose of like having them join the activist mission, but you can think about it in terms of like, yeah, if I have kids and I raise them to like have good values and to care about their community and to care about living in a different kind of world than the one that we're currently living in, then that I think can also be a vehicle for change.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And I think, I mean, a couple of things I want to highlight here. It's just because you have this certainty and this excitement around the decision doesn't mean, it sounds like, that it's entirely without questioning, that there's like aspects of it that you think, oh gosh, this sounds scary, or, how would I contend with that? Like, it's not an obliviousness. Would you agree with that? I mean, of course, you'd probably say, no, I'm not oblivious. Okay. kind of a rhetorical question, but yeah. And so, I also, and I actually think you articulated what you just said quite nicely in a recent Instagram post of yours, where you talked about, yes, let's be aware of what is happening to us and others, and say, like, we can say this is terrible, and to give compassion to that and empathy and have awareness, again, both whether it's self or other, but also not to like, victimhood maybe is the wrong word to use. That may seem a little bit kind of careless to say here, but like this idea of also we have to then bear responsibility to say, okay, what can my role in this be? And I love to ask myself and my clients, where do I have control here? We certainly cannot control everything, but we can control whether it's a response, whether it's, an action that we take, whether it's, just being in kind of presence with what is. And so I like how you've brought that to this question of the kids or child-free equation, because I think it's both. It's about saying, okay, tough things can happen and there will be difficulties in raising children, certainly. But there's also this real attitude of like enacting something positive and having a certain amount of like autonomy and control over that process. A certain amount, of course. So one thing you mentioned, you talk about with having children when the timing is right. And so I'm interested, what is your discernment of that, or sort of how do you foresee that or hope to have that kind of play out in the future with regards to the circumstances or factors in which you would like to have a child or children?
Yeah. For me personally, a lot of it is about financial stability, wanting to be financially stable before having kids. Another big element is like, where am I at in my relationship with my partner? And, do we feel as though we have built enough of a solid foundation between the two of us that we can navigate conflicts and challenges that are likely to come up in becoming parents? Because having a child is something that puts a lot of stress on a relationship. And so I want to feel secure in mine and my partner's ability to, you know, communicate in a healthy way with each other and to employ good conflict resolution skills and good cooperative skills to be able to navigate those challenges as they come up.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it reminds me, I mean, you of course work with the body and sort of accessing that inner wisdom, but also connecting those different parts of ourselves. And so to me, this is kind of a question of like balancing the head and the heart, in the sense that when we come to this decision, I think there is a big aspect of like, what does our internal compass say? However, we operate in the real world, and there are factors to consider, like the ones you've just mentioned. So for you, what or how would that balancing act look? And maybe we can even think in terms of someone who's grappling with this, because what I sometimes see is people move the target, so to speak. It's like, okay, when I'm financially stable, well, we're actually quite stable. And, I got a promotion and there's more money coming in. Well, maybe when we are more stable, when we have more money, when we have more abundance, or, our relationship's good. Is it good enough? Has it been good? Like, so what's kind of the metric there? Or how do you think that you're going to be able to discern that right timing?
Yeah. I'm not sure that we can ever really know, like, in terms of projecting into the future, this is how I will know that the time is right. If I was working with a client who was sort of grappling with this question, like in the present time, I think what I would want to do is to work from what we call the internal family systems perspective, where we're acknowledging, okay, we have one part that's saying this, one part that's saying this, maybe there's another part that's saying something completely different. And can we make space for all of those parts to share how they're feeling about this decision, and have a lot of empathy and compassion and understanding for all of the different perspectives that are coming in here? And sometimes when you do that, you may realize that there's another part that's kind of been operating underneath the surface that hasn't really gotten any real airtime. The part that's saying, well, I have to be even more financially stable, could actually be sort of blocking or masking a part that's saying, I'm really scared about doing this. And I'm kind of looking for reasons to delay it because I'm scared. And that's a totally and understandable, normal feeling. So can we make space to really sit with the fear and acknowledge it and have compassion for it and recognize that the fear is here because it's helping you in some way?
Yeah. Okay. This, first of all, internal family systems. I said it right, right? Internal family systems. Okay. I just want to make sure I got that right. I know it's IFS. Interesting. I've experienced a little bit of that as like on the client patient side, if you will. I'm interested. So I want to go down this line of thinking a little bit more, because I agree. I think there are different aspects and parts of themselves that are sort of at war with this decision. And this is what I see with my clients is like, you've got one part of you saying maybe, oh, this seems exciting. Or you've got another part that says, I've got this pressure from family. You've got this other part of you that says, if I don't, I'm going to regret it. You've got like all these different competing like fears and emotions and, the good, bad, the ugly, if you will. So what, if you can delve into it a little bit more, understanding, of course, these are tools that take time to use, but like, what are some of the approaches that you might use, or what might a next step be for someone who's grappling with those different voices, if you will?
Yeah. I think that the most important thing to remember when you're working with the internal family systems model is you never want to try to force your parts to do one particular thing or another. So like, you never want to force them to try to change their mind about something, like you don't want to like force them to back down. You want to give a lot of empathy, compassion, and understanding for whatever it is that they're feeling, whatever opinions that they have. And also, I think another thing that can be really helpful is sometimes we talk about like this metaphor of, you know, all parts get a voice, but they don't necessarily get a vote. And what that means is that all of your parts can have their, you know, like their opinions and their feelings about whatever is going on, whatever decision that you're facing. But at the end of the day, you get to make that choice. Sometimes we use the analogy of you're the driver of the car, and you know, you want to bring your parts along for the ride. You know, they're going to be in the car, and they have they can have their opinion about, you know, like, do you want to turn left or do you want to turn right, or like what's the destination that you're going to. But at the end of the day, you get to make that choice. You get to listen to all of them, and you get to take into consideration what they're telling you, and then you get to make the decision.
Yeah. So with this idea of everyone gets a voice, not everyone gets a vote, I was going to ask you, who gets the vote? It sounds like you as a whole get the vote. Is that correct? How do we know how to vote? I know I'm being a pain here, but like, I mean, if all my competing parts are telling me do it, don't do it, it's going to be great, it's going to suck. Like, it's like, it's kind of like trying to decide what restaurant to go to when all your friends want to go somewhere else. So how would you suggest like who to listen to?
I'm going to do an annoying therapist thing here and say, I can't tell you how to vote.
Yeah.
I can't tell you that. And I mean, like, if you were my client sitting in front of me, I would probably ask, you know, how does it feel that I can't tell you how to vote? And can we get curious about that?
I'm mad at you.
That's okay.
No, it's funny because I think that was top of mind. I saw, and by the way, if everyone listening, if you've not heard of Katherine Ripley, definitely give her a follow on Instagram. She has incredible content. And I saw one of your recent reels was actually about like, it's okay for you to be mad at me. That's the space I hold as your therapist. I'm here for it. Yeah. Okay.
One more thing I actually want to add about this is that like sometimes that, that questioning of like, you know, like, how do I know how to vote? You know, like, how do I know what decision to make? You know, like, can you please help me make this choice? You know, like, tell me like what I should do here. That is a part in and of itself, that part that's sort of like wanting someone else to make the decision for you, or like wanting somebody else to say to you, yes, that is definitely the right choice for you. So that is something in and of itself that you can get curious about. Like, I have this part of me that wants someone else to make this decision for me, or that wants somebody to give me certainty about what I'm doing. We can get curious about the part of you that wants that, and maybe potentially explore the historical origins of that part. That's something that I would do if I had a client where that was coming up for them.
Yeah. No, I'm not a therapist. I do coaching, but I would totally agree with you. And I think a couple of things you've highlighted throughout this conversation so far are curiosity and compassion. And I think, like you say, listening, what does that part of yourself have to say? Because I feel like we hear these kind of talk tracks or thought tracks on repeat, but we don't actually really listen. We're just like, yeah, okay. Like, or we think it kind of like we ruminate it. I'm going to regret it. I'm going to regret it. But instead of saying like, okay, regret what? Tell me about that. Interesting. Like, you know, what have I regretted in the past? What makes me think that? Who's telling me that? And rather than being that really harsh judge, to be somebody who's like, yeah, curious about it. I know for me on my own journey to getting clarity that the child-free path was the one for me. Such a big part of it was having self-compassion about the way I was feeling, rather than thinking like, what is wrong with you? Feeling shameful, pointing a finger, saying, you're unwomanly. You shouldn't think that. You shouldn't feel that. Why don't you feel that way? Instead, I was like, oh, that's really interesting. I feel that way. I wonder what may have happened that would lead to that. And sometimes we don't know, but like it helped me kind of get underneath a little bit. And to take that perspective as like the curious outsider as opposed to this like harsh inner critic.
Yeah. Everything changes when you start to look at your own thought patterns with this attitude of like, that's so interesting.
All right, it's time to hear what more of you are saying about the Kids Are Child-Free podcast. This one is from Loon22 via Apple Podcasts in Great Britain, who says, well-balanced and insightful. 5 out of 5 stars. Keltie has created a perfect tool for anyone experiencing ambivalence surrounding the decision of kids or child-free. These episodes are well-balanced with a window into both sides of the story. Brilliant podcast. You're brilliant, Loon22. Thank you for leaving these words about our podcast. If you're listening right now and you're thinking, oh shoot, I really would like Keltie to read out one of my reviews on an upcoming episode of the podcast, maybe you will be so lucky. At the very least, I will be very grateful if you go leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, which I will link to in the show notes. Give us a 5 out of 5 star review. Leave some kind words. This is going to help other people to discover this podcast so they too can get some clarity on this kids or child-free decision. I want to talk about trauma since this is an area that you specialize in and work with people on. And This is a big question that comes up for people. And maybe to start, actually, I wouldn't mind if you could give like a brief definition when we speak about trauma. What kinds of things or what we may be referring to broadly speaking? Because I think people will either easily identify with that or they might think, well, you know, as we often hear and say, I had a good upbringing, you know, my parents didn't abuse me or whatever. I wasn't traumatized. So what does trauma encompass or entail, first of all?
I use a very broad definition. The definition that I use is trauma is too much, too fast, too soon. And alternatively, the too much could also be not enough, because trauma is not just when something happens to you that should not have happened. It's also when something should have happened to you that did not happen. So you did not receive support, empathy, connection, love. That can also be considered trauma.
Okay, interesting. I'd also read or heard something that like, and I won't get into the exact textbook definitions of different types of trauma, but that I think often think of trauma as a single event, which it can be, but it can also be sort of those like continuous circumstances in which we find ourselves, which I would imagine might make it a little bit more difficult to pinpoint, as opposed to saying, my parent died in an accident. It's like, my mother was emotionally unavailable. That may be a little bit less tangible for people to be able to articulate and grasp at. Is that true? Can those both be traumatic experiences for people?
Yes, they can. And for the reasons that you're talking about, I actually don't necessarily use the word trauma so much anymore in my content. You know, I tend to talk more about like, you know, more specific circumstances like emotional neglect and, you know, growing up with an emotionally immature parent, because that has become sort of like, you know, most of my focus for, you know, like what I'm supporting my clients with processing. And I don't want people to, you know, be like averse to working with me or like think that they don't belong in the space that I've created because their experience doesn't fit the definition of trauma. But if we are going to talk in terms of trauma, I do use that broad definition because all of those things, like everything that can be encompassed under that umbrella, has the potential to create a wound inside of the person that needs to be healed.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense what you're saying there. And I think, fortunately or unfortunately, I think when some of these words come into our common language, that can be a positive. It can make people aware of things that maybe are impacting them, that they've experienced that have been painful or, you know, left wounds. I also think it can become, we use it maybe a little bit flippantly. Certainly, I'm sure you see many examples of using that term or terminology surrounding trauma incorrectly in a way that makes it like people saying, oh, this is triggering for me. Everything's triggering. I don't like the cheese on my pizza. It's like everything can kind of become like pervasively infiltrated with some of these ideas, perhaps in incorrect ways. So I appreciate you giving voice and clarification to that. And I think in this case, probably what we really want to get underneath of in the limited time we have, which we'll probably have to have you back in the future, Katherine, is that one thing a lot of people are asking, whether or not they identify with this idea of trauma or like adverse events, what have you, is that there are things that have happened in their life up till now, and specifically with regards to their relationship with their parent or parents, that they are asking, has that impacted my desire or lack of desire or the ambivalence that I'm feeling? It's certainly something I ask myself looking at, okay, what examples did I see in my own home as far as my mom's role as mother, my parents' relationship with one another, the way I was treated as a child, the way for me as the eldest in the family. And so I think it's a healthy, normal thing for us to want to explore that. But then it kind of brings up questions of, am I feeling the way I'm feeling because of things that have happened to me? And first of all, for people who have experienced something like neglect, abuse, difficult, challenging situations where they really felt that they weren't either provided for, that they were on the receiving end of terrible behaviors, of course, to be for anyone, but especially as a child. What I hear from those people is that they're worried that they're going to perpetuate similar or the same behaviors should they become parents. And they also sort of worry or wonder, like, is this clouding my vision? So if I'm somebody who had, let's say, been abused as a child and I'm grappling with this question, how do you sort of involve that factor to help me figure out, am I a safe person to be able to have my own child? Could I do this myself? And B, how do I know that this isn't going to negatively impact my kid, even if I don't do the same thing, just by nature of how it shaped me?
So it sounds like the first question that you're asking is, what if going through adverse childhood circumstances is influencing this, your opinions about this question of like, should I choose to have children or not?
Yeah,
and
agreed.
The way that I would respond to that question is, of course it is.
Yeah.
Because our childhoods always influence the decisions that we make as adults, like the paths that we choose to go down. Our childhood experiences have influences over who we choose as a partner. Like if you choose to be in a relationship, it has influence over what career you choose to have, what city or country you choose to move to. I mean, our childhoods are always going to have influence over the decisions that we make. And I would suggest kind of going back to what we talked about earlier, where you observe that and take it in a more neutral way. Like not putting a judgment on top of it, not necessarily thinking like, oh, like my trauma is really making me think this way. And like, that's so bad. Like, no, it's not a bad thing. You can observe that, like in a non-judgmental way, like, wow, I think this thing. And, I think that's because I went through XYZ growing up. And, now here I've learned something about myself. How great for me. So that's how I would answer the first part of the question. And in regards to the second part, which is, how do I know if the trauma or the pain that I'm carrying is going to influence the way that I would parent a child if I do choose to become a parent? And I would kind of want to reframe that a little bit and say that it's really impossible to know for sure how your parenting would be impacted, because that's like a future oriented sort of thinking. We can't predict the future, but I would maybe want to change the question to, if I do choose to have children, what can I do to be the best parent that I possibly can be, in spite of not having had good parents myself? What can I do to reduce as much as possible the impact that the intergenerational trauma in my family will have on my child? Because when we ask the question that way, then we open up to the possibilities of, things that you can learn, books that you can read, podcasts that you can listen to, in order to give yourself a lot of skills to be able to be the best parent that you can be, even if you didn't necessarily have great parents yourself.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's that shift that we talked about earlier in our conversation of like going to this feeling of empowerment. What can I do versus like, look what may happen as a result of this. And like, oh, I don't want to say woe is me. You can feel woe is you, certainly if bad, difficult things have happened, but it's more like, how am I going to respond to this? Should I choose to parent versus this fear that it's like this external force that's going to be acting upon you, that you also have a chance to respond to that. And I was going to ask, I mean, you give examples like books, podcasts. Are there other things that you would suggest if someone feels like their past experiences have really been harmful to them that they can do? Should they be considering parenthood?
Yeah. I think that there's two main skills that everybody would need to work on if they are considering becoming a parent. And I'm speaking here, not as someone who is a parent, but as somebody who has, studied attachment theory and, like how, caregiver, behaviors have an impact on children at an early age.
Yeah.
I think that the two things that everybody needs to be able to do are one, emotional regulation, and two, taking ownership of your own emotions. When it comes to emotional regulation, a parent's job essentially is to lend their prefrontal cortex to their child, because a child does not have a developed prefrontal cortex. And so they're in their emotional brain pretty much all the time. They don't have the capacity to self-regulate. And so as an adult, you have to lend your prefrontal cortex to be your child's emotional regulation system. But you can't do that if you yourself are dysregulated. So you have to be capable of, when you have a big feeling that's coming up, or if you're getting triggered, you have to be able to regulate yourself, get your own prefrontal cortex back online so that you're not just like in the amygdala, like in the reptile brain, so that you can be a source of emotional regulation for your child. And the second thing that you have to be able to do is you have to be able to recognize when there's an emotion that's coming up that's part of your historical material. You have to be able to take ownership of that. I think that a lot of the harm that gets done when we're talking about, like emotionally immature parents, which is again, like a lot of the work that I do with people is sort of like recovering from having an emotionally immature parent, is that their parent projected all of their stuff onto them. Like all of the anger and the grief that their parent had about their own childhood and what they didn't get, what they never got that they should have gotten, that ends up getting projected onto their own kid. If you do not take ownership of your own emotions, you will project them onto other people, or you will displace them onto other people. It's guaranteed to happen. And that's why these skills are actually beneficial for everybody, whether you choose to have a child or not. It's going to improve your relationships with all of the people in your life if you can learn to do these things.
100% agree. Side note, I mentioned I struggle with anxiety, and my husband read a book about it recently, and he's learning all these things, and he used the term emotional regulation recently, and he's like, you need to learn how to better emotionally regulate. And I was like, I was so impressed, actually. I was like, bless your heart. And I had a moment the other day where I was going to lose my cool, and I took a few deep breaths, and I kind of thought through like these explosive actions of my mind. And I said, there was a moment for some emotional regulation there. And I totally agree. I mean, I think this is something that can be beneficial, certainly if you're in a relationship with someone. Obviously, we're all in relationship with the people in our lives, in our businesses. I guess the big question is, and of course, knowing you can't impart all of your professional and personal wisdom on us, like how do we do that? And are there, I know there's certain tools you use in your practice, like what should we be looking for if we want to, let's say, work with a therapist or take a program or what have you? And actually, sidebar, and this was not intentional, I've set this up really nicely, but I think you do have a program that helps with some of this, if I'm not mistaken, which feel free to plug it, please do, because we need to know.
Yes. So I do have a course coming up in June where I am going to give tools and skills for emotional regulation. And I'm also going to be using a lot of the IFS principles that I talked about to support people in being able to identify their emotions, sit with their emotions in their body, and be able to take care of those young parts that are holding a lot of that pain from the adverse childhood experiences, and kind of teaching people, how do you have compassion and empathy for those young parts of you, and how can you be the parent that those young parts of you needed but did not get.
So, plot twist here, folks. Even if you maybe decide not to have kids, there's still going to be parenting in your future if you want to resolve some of these experiences. Is this what I'm hearing? That, like,
yes.
I mean, we haven't talked too much. We talked, of course, about childhood experiences, but really the idea is that that part of ourselves, that our inner child, if you will, is still requires, or maybe not still, perhaps for the first time, requires a parent to really hold and feel those emotions and experiences. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, good stuff. I have to say, I was checking out your course details, and I don't think it's going to work for me this round, but I'm actually quite interested myself, because I just think all of us have had experiences in our lives. Again, whether we live the picture perfect upbringing or whether it was something dramatically different than that, I think there's opportunity for us to expand this skill set and to be able to be more within ourselves and all of ourselves, and to have compassion and listening for that. I have, before we wrap things up, and of course I have my infamous rapid fire questions, which are going to be tricky today, because usually it's like the questions depend on what side of the fence you're on. So I guess we'll do that. We'll treat them as though you are, I know you're not a mom yet, but we'll address them from that side. But first of all, and don't worry, don't need to have any special parenting know-how to answer them. Before we do that, I have one last question around this notion of parentification. And what I hear from some people is, because they had to take on an early role, essentially parenting their parents in some capacity. This may not be in literal terms, and perhaps you can give a better, more apt description. But they really have this reluctance of taking on that role themselves. It's like the child-free perspective and path really appeals to them, in the sense that they're kind of feel like, I'm done. I've done this. I took on that role. So I would love to hear a little bit about parentification, and then kind of how that plays into this decision. And is that okay? Like, because again, I think there can be this resentment or this feeling of like, is that the right response to then not have kids because I feel resentment for having been the parent? The other part of that, and this is just a personal question of mine, parentification I often see in the context of what happened when we were children. However, and I see this with a lot of people I know and clients I work with, it can also happen, I think, later in life, and sometimes perhaps in adulthood, where the roles reverse at a certain point, through illness, through death, through an accident, through whatever it may be. And that, I think, can put a lot of pressure on people, especially us as women who often take on that role within the family, to then feel like, I'm done. I don't want to do this. So I know that was kind of a multi-part question, but I guess I'm wondering, with parentification, do you have thoughts on this decision? And can you just clarify what that actually entails?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that the way you described it was very accurate. I mean, parentification is essentially, it's a role reversal that happens in childhood, where the child is taking care of the parent rather than the other way around, like it should be. And you're right, it definitely can happen in adulthood. I don't know that we would necessarily use the same word for it, but sometimes there are circumstances in adulthood where, you do have to take on like a really heavy caretaking load for somebody in your life. And that can also have an impact. And if that influences a decision not to have children, I think that's fine. I don't think that there's necessarily a reason to problematize that. If there is some resentment there that kind of sounds like, oh, like I'm so angry at my parents for forcing me to take care of them to the point that now I don't feel like I want to have children, then that's something to, number one, have empathy and compassion for. And number two, to maybe get curious about, is there one of those hidden parts underneath there? Is there a part that's saying, oh, but I kind of do want to have kids and I'm not getting to have a voice because these other parts that are so tired of the caretaking responsibilities are taking up all of the mic time here.
Yeah.
So if you can get curious about, is there another part that's kind of operating underneath the surface that hasn't gotten to speak?
Yeah.
Can we bring it forward? Can we give it mic time? Can we let that part have some time to say how they feel about the situation? Yeah. And then maybe it becomes, more of a, not necessarily that like the scale is tipped like so far this way, but then it becomes more of a like, okay, maybe I do feel two ways about it. That's great. You get to learn something about yourself and you get to listen to another perspective about this decision.
Totally. Well, and I think if you're harboring that kind of resentment, like it's never not going to have a positive impact of some sort, I would think, on your current life, whether or not you have kids, and potentially the relationship you have with your parent or parents, should they be, in your life today. Okay, so much good stuff. I could talk to you for like the next 4 hours. And my husband was actually like, so how long are these podcast episodes? I said, well, I keep them under an hour. I said, I don't have the ego of all these male podcasters who shall not be named, who have like 3-hour long episodes and think I have nothing better than to hear them talk. He said, well, what do your listeners need? I'm like, I don't know what my listener, I mean, I know a few things my listeners need, but I'm like, I know for me, if I see great guests on these long podcasts, I just think I'm never going to do that. Never going to listen to the 2-3 hour episodes. So, okay. So on that note, speaking of wrapping things up and talking quickly, I've got 5 rapid fire questions that I love to ask all my guests. The first 2 are finish the sentence. Being a mom is?
Joyful.
Being a mom is not?
Easy.
What is one thing that you think would make this decision easier for women and other folks who are on the fence? Whether that's something like psychologically speaking or societally, what do you think might make this decision a little less difficult?
Honestly, the first thing that came to mind was better social support. Like, free childcare.
Amen. So good. Yep. Won't disagree with you. Yeah. I guess, we could say a lot more. I'm like, nothing more to say. We've got a lot more to say on that, but no, I agree. What is one, that's a whole other conversation. Although, do you have anything further you want to add on that?
I think that I'm sort of coming at it from like the economic perspective there. That's one thing that I know I have anxiety about is, like being able to have enough financial resources to support a child and give them a good life.
Yeah, for sure. All right. What is one thing that you would like child-free people to know?
I think I just want to say that I'm happy for you. Your choice is valid. And, if you're happy with the way that you've chosen to live your life, then I'm happy for you.
Awesome. I love that. All right. Lastly, if you could give one piece of advice to someone who's currently on the fence about whether or not to have kids, what would that be?
I think I would say don't rush your decision. Give yourself all the time that you need to listen to all of the different parts of you and, what those parts are saying. I think there's a lot of societal pressure that women in particular face about like, oh, like your biological clock is ticking. Like, I mean, I would say don't listen to that. I think it's more important to take your time and give yourself enough space to hear all of the different ways that your parts feel about this. And, if you do run into medical issues trying to conceive, like if you're choosing to be pregnant, then that's something that, that's a problem that can be addressed in various different ways. There's always going to be a solution that you can find to that. I think it's more important to really allow yourself patience to think this through for as long as you need to think it through for.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. All right. As we wrap things up, Katherine, where can we find you? How can we find out about the course? Tell us all the things we need to know.
Yeah. So you can find me on Instagram at therapy.with.Katherine with a K. And you can find me on TikTok at therapy with Katherine, all one word. And if you find me on social, that'll lead you to my website, and you can read all about the course curriculum and the course dates on my website. And if you have any questions about it, you can always feel free to reach out to me.
Awesome. Well, I certainly hope listeners will reach out to you. I know it's been super valuable having you on today, both hearing your own sort of perspective on this kids or child-free decision, of course, your expertise, your professional expertise as well. And we will make sure to include all of those links in the show notes of today's episode as well. So you get it right. Therapy with Katherine or therapy _, etc. Just in case you didn't capture it all, we'll have that there for you. So thank you so much for coming on. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation and I wish you a wonderful rest of your day.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for tuning in for this latest episode of the Kids Are Child-Free podcast. Now, before you go, I have a little something to share with you, and that is I want you to go check out the free resources page at kidsorchildfree.com because I have some goodies on there for you, guides you can download. I've got a recording of a class that you can check out, different tools, exercises, resources to help support you to make the kids or child-free decision that's right for you. I will link to that in today's show notes. And again, you can also find that at kidsorchildfree.com. That's all from me. I wish you a beautiful rest of your day, and I will see you back here very soon.